Welcome to Nightshift Horror. Before we check in tonight, don't forget to like, subscribe, and let me know where you're tuning in from. Now get comfortable. The night shift is about to begin. The cardboard box split as I lifted it, spilling patient files across the concrete floor like fallen leaves. That should have been my first warning. I'd been hired by the State Historical Society to digitize the remaining records from Millfield State Hospital before the demolition crew arrived. 3 weeks, they told me. Catalog what's salvageable, scan what's significant, and let the rest become rubble. Standard archival work. The kind I'd done a dozen times before at other defunct institutions. The basement records room stretched longer than it appeared from the entrance. Fluorescent fixtures hummed overhead, casting that familiar institutional pallor across rows of metal shelving. Each shelf bore boxes labeled with year ranges: 1962, 1965, 1971, 1974, 1983, 1987. The organization was pristine, almost obsessive. Someone had taken great care to preserve these files, even as the hospital above slowly surrendered to decay. I started with the earliest records, working methodically through intake forms and treatment notes. The handwriting was careful, clinical. Dr. Margaret Caldwell, chief psychiatrist. Her signature appeared on nearly every document from the 1960s: admission orders, therapy session notes, discharge summaries. The files painted a picture of institutional routine: morning medications, group sessions, family visits, carefully monitored and documented. By noon, I'd processed 3 boxes. The work was meditative in its repetition. Scan the patient number, check the dates, sort by category: therapeutic, administrative, incident reports. The rhythm of it almost made me forget I was sitting in the bowels of an abandoned psychiatric hospital. That's when I found the file with today's date, November 15th, 2024. The tab was typed on the same age paper as the others, but the date made no sense. Millfield had closed in 1983. I opened the folder expecting some clerical error, maybe a misfiled document from another institution. Instead, I found my own intake form. Patient name: David Harrison Polk. Date of admission: November 15th, 2024. Admitting physician: Dr. Margaret Caldwell. Reason for admission: archival delusions. Subject believes he is cataloging historical records when in fact he is organizing his own case file. The handwriting matched the other files perfectly. That same careful script I'd been reading all morning. But it described my actions from the past 3 hours in clinical detail. My arrival time, the torn cardboard box, even my methodical sorting system, noted with the detached precision of a psychiatric observation. I set the file aside and continued working, telling myself it was someone's elaborate joke. Former employees, maybe? Urban explorers with too much time and a working knowledge of hospital procedures. But when I returned the next morning, 3 new files had appeared in the box I'd already emptied. Each one documented my previous day's work. My lunch break at 12:47. The way I'd paused at the file with my name, checking it twice before setting it aside. The exact time I'd left, 4:23 p.m. The notes were signed by Dr. Caldwell in the same careful handwriting, dated 40 years after her retirement. The 3rd file contained my morning routine from that very day. How I'd stopped for coffee at the diner on Route 9, the way I'd sat in my car for 6 minutes before entering the building, reading through my assignment notes. It described my growing unease as productive paranoid ideation and recommended continued observation. I photographed everything, sent the images to my supervisor, to colleagues, to anyone who might explain what I was seeing. The responses were identical. The files appeared blank in every photograph. Empty manila folders with typed labels but no content visible on camera, yet I could see them clearly. Touch them. Read Dr. Caldwell's notes as she documented my increasing agitation, my failed attempts to photograph evidence, my growing isolation as others failed to witness what I was experiencing. Each day brought new files. They appeared overnight, perfectly aged, documenting not just my actions but my thoughts, my growing obsession with the records, my inability to stop returning to the basement even as my 3-week assignment stretched into a month. Subject demonstrates compulsive behavior regarding documentation. Refuses to acknowledge completion of project. Shows signs of institutional attachment disorder. The files began predicting my actions. I would read about my planned lunch break before I felt hungry, about my decision to work late before I consciously made it. Dr. Caldwell's notes described conversations I hadn't yet had, decisions I hadn't yet made, growing paranoia I hadn't yet felt. Yesterday, I found the final file in the series. Its edges were pristine as if freshly typed. The label read, David Harrison Polk, Discharge Summary. Patient has achieved full integration with archival system. Documentation complete. Subject may now be processed with other historical records. Inside was a death certificate signed by Dr. Caldwell and dated today. Cause of death, integration with institutional memory. Time of death, pending completion of final catalog entry. I'm writing this on my laptop in the records room, surrounded by boxes that never seem to empty. The fluorescent lights hum their familiar tune overhead. My phone shows 17 missed calls from my supervisor, but I can't seem to make myself leave. The files are waiting. They always know what I'm going to do next. Some records, I've learned, never stop updating, even after everyone who is supposed to read them has been filed away themselves. The radio static cut through my half-sleep like breaking glass. Engine 47 was parked outside the 24-hour diner on Millbrook Road, my partner Jake finishing his fourth cup of coffee while I dozed in the passenger seat. Standard overnight shift for Riverside County Emergency Services, mostly medical calls and the occasional drunk driver. Unit 23, respond to structure fire, 1247 Hillcrest Drive, Blackridge State Hospital Complex. Report of smoke in Ward East, possible occupancy. I sat up, suddenly alert. Jake looked at me over his coffee cup, eyebrows raised. Blackridge had been demolished in 1982. We both knew that. The whole complex had been razed after the state shut it down. The land sold to developers who'd built a shopping plaza where the main building once stood. Dispatch. Unit 23. Can you repeat that address? We show Blackridge Hospital as demolished. The radio hissed for a moment before the dispatcher's voice returned, oddly distorted. Unit 23. Confirmed structure fire at Blackridge Complex. Ward East showing active alarm system. Multiple units requested for evacuation protocol. Jake started the engine without another word. Protocol was protocol, even when protocol made no sense. Maybe someone was burning debris in the old foundation. Maybe there were squatters in buildings we'd missed. Maybe dispatch had the address wrong and we'd figure it out when we got there. The GPS directed us down roads I hadn't traveled in years. Past the old highway department building, through the industrial district where most of the streetlights had burned out and never been replaced. The landscape looked different at night, more overgrown, more angular. Trees seemed to lean closer to the road. There, Jake said, pointing through the windshield. I saw it too. A complex of low brick buildings arranged around a central courtyard, exactly where my memory insisted there should be nothing but empty lots and strip malls. The architecture was distinctly institutional. Narrow windows, flat roofs, the kind of purposeful ugliness that marked government buildings from the 1950s. But that wasn't what made my chest tighten. It was the lights. Windows glowed yellow throughout the complex, and I could see the steady flash of emergency lighting along the main corridor. An active fire alarm system cycling through its rotation just like dispatch had said. Jesus, Jake whispered. How is this here? I checked my GPS again. The screen showed our location as an empty field. No buildings, no roads leading to where we were now parked. But the radio crackled again with the dispatcher's voice, clearer now. Unit 23, Ward East evacuation in progress. Report to main entrance for assignment coordination. The main entrance was clearly marked with a sign that looked freshly painted. Blackridge State Hospital. Visitor registration required. The glass doors stood open, and I could see a reception desk in the lobby beyond. The fluorescent lighting inside had that harsh institutional quality I remembered from active hospitals. Jake grabbed the radio as we approached. Dispatch Unit 23 on scene. We're not seeing any smoke or active fire. Building appears occupied. Request backup units. Unit 23, confirmed backup en route. Proceed to Ward East for evacuation coordination. Contact Interior Command on arrival. The lobby smelled like disinfectant and floor wax. Behind the reception desk, papers were scattered as if someone had left in a hurry. A half-empty coffee cup sat next to a phone with multiple lines blinking. The directory on the wall listed departments I'd never heard of alongside familiar ones: emergency services, patient records, Ward East, transitional care, Ward West, extended observation. An intercom crackled overhead. All emergency personnel report to Ward East. Evacuation in progress. We followed the signs through corridors that seemed to stretch further than the building's exterior dimensions should have allowed. The floors were polished linoleum, the walls that institutional green that all hospitals seem to favor. Occasionally we passed other personnel, orderlies in white uniforms, nurses with clipboards, a man in a suit who nodded at us professionally as we walked by. None of them spoke. None of them seemed surprised to see us. Ward East was a long corridor lined with patient rooms. Most of the doors stood open, revealing beds that had been recently occupied, sheets rumpled, personal items on bedside tables, call buttons still blinking red. But no patients, no staff, just the steady pulse of the emergency lighting and the distant sound of the fire alarm. That's when I realized I hadn't seen any smoke. No heat signatures, no actual emergency except for the alarm system itself, cycling through its automated routine. Jake tried his radio. Static. The building seemed to be interfering with our communications, though the facility's own intercom system worked perfectly. It continued providing updates on the evacuation that we couldn't see happening. All patients from Ward East successfully transferred to alternate facilities. Emergency personnel may begin final sweep. We walked the entire corridor, checking every room. Some contained evidence of recent occupancy: warm coffee cups, books left open, televisions still tuned to late-night programming. Others were sterile, empty, waiting. The last room at the end of the hall had our names written on the door's whiteboard: J. Morrison, D. Chen, Emergency Response Team. Inside were 2 beds with our uniforms laid out neatly on fresh linens. Clipboards on the bedside tables contained intake forms with our personal information: addresses, emergency contacts, medical histories we'd never provided. The forms were signed by someone listed as attending physician, transitional care unit. Jake's hand was shaking as he pointed to the signature line. "Dave, that's your handwriting." It was. My signature, my pen pressure, my particular way of crossing T's, but I had no memory of signing anything. The date on the form was yesterday, a day I'd spent at home, nowhere near any hospital. The intercom clicked on again. Emergency response complete. All personnel report to transportation for return to assigned facilities. We found the transportation area through corridors that seemed to rearrange themselves as we walked. The exit led to a parking garage where our ambulance waited, engine still running. But parked next to it was another identical ambulance with the same unit number, the same equipment, the same coffee-stained radio console. I climbed into the driver's seat of what I assumed was our vehicle. The radio crackled immediately. Unit 23, status report. Jake grabbed the handset. Dispatch Unit 23, evacuation complete, no active emergency found. Returning to service. Copy, Unit 23, returning to service. Next assignment, standby at Millbrook Road Diner for possible medical calls. As we drove away, I watched the complex shrink in my mirrors until it disappeared entirely. The GPS showed us traveling through empty lots again, past the strip mall that definitely occupied the space where Blackridge had stood moments before. But our call log showed a completed run to 1247 Hillcrest Drive. 4 hours on scene. Successful evacuation of Ward East, all patients transferred to alternate facilities. The paperwork was already filled out in handwriting I recognized as mine. Jake was quiet until we reached the diner. Finally he spoke. "Dave, I've been thinking about that radio call." The dispatcher's voice. "What about it?" When they said all personnel report to transportation, that wasn't dispatch. That was you. Your voice coming through the hospital's intercom system. I checked the recording function on our radio. It had been active the entire time, but when I played it back, I heard only my own voice providing both sides of the conversation. Dispatch asking for status reports, me responding, but also me giving the dispatch instructions, coordinating the evacuation, managing the call from both ends. The timestamp showed I'd been talking to myself for 4 hours. Sometimes emergency calls take you places that don't exist on any official map. The trick is remembering which voice in the radio is really yours, and which one is just echoing back from buildings that refuse to stay demolished. The light was perfect when I arrived at Riverside State Hospital, that golden hour before sunset when abandoned buildings take on an almost romantic quality. Broken windows become geometric art. Peeling paint transforms into abstract patterns. Decay becomes beautiful when framed correctly. My graduate advisor had approved the location for my thesis project. Institutional memory, documenting America's forgotten spaces. Riverside had been closed since 1975, long enough for nature to begin reclaiming the complex, but recent enough that the architecture remained largely intact, perfect for the kind of haunting beauty I wanted to capture. I'd brought 4 rolls of black and white film, enough for a full afternoon of shooting. Digital would have been easier, but there was something about film that suited these places. The deliberate process, the limited shots, the way you had to really see before clicking the shutter. It forced you to be present with your subject. The main building rose 4 stories from an overgrown courtyard. Art Deco details still visible despite decades of weather damage. I started with exterior shots, wide angles to establish the scale, detail work on the decorative stonework, studies of light filtering through broken glass. Through my viewfinder, the building looked magnificently desolate. Ivy climbed the walls like green veins. Birds nested in the broken clock tower. Windows stared out like empty eyes. All the romantic cliches of abandonment photography, but executed with the technical precision my thesis committee expected. I moved inside as the light began to fade. The main corridor stretched into shadow, punctuated by doorways that framed smaller compositions. Patient rooms with rusted bed frames. A common area where institutional furniture sat arranged as if waiting for occupants who would never return. That's where I first noticed the figure. In my peripheral vision, a dark shape seemed to move across the far end of the corridor. When I looked directly, nothing. Just shadows in the play of light through broken glass. I raised my camera and focused on the space where I thought I'd seen movement. Through the viewfinder, the corridor appeared empty. I clicked the shutter anyway. The sound echoed strangely in the abandoned space. Not the sharp crack of a camera mechanism, but something softer, like a sigh. I advanced the film and continued shooting, working my way through the common areas and into the residential wings. By the time I finished the first roll, the sun had set. I loaded fresh film and switched to long exposures, letting the available light from street lamps and passing cars paint streaks across the institutional walls. The results would be ethereal, ghostly, perfect for the aesthetic I was pursuing. That night in my darkroom, I developed the first roll with the careful attention I gave all my thesis work. Each negative was examined, contact sheets printed with precise timing. Most shots looked exactly as I remembered taking them. Empty corridors, abandoned furniture, architectural details emerging from shadow, except for the figure. In every photograph, someone stood behind me. The same dark silhouette, always positioned just over my left shoulder, wearing what appeared to be the same hooded jacket I'd worn during the shoot. The figure never faced the camera directly, but its presence was unmistakable in shot after shot. I examined the negatives under magnification. No double exposure, no processing error. The figure was there, captured in silver halide with the same clarity as everything else in frame. The next day, I returned to Riverside with 2 cameras, one loaded with fresh film, the other a digital SLR for comparison. I wanted to reshoot several compositions, maybe catch whatever reflection or shadow had created the previous day's anomaly. I positioned myself in the same corridor where the figure had appeared most clearly. Raised both cameras, framed the shot identically. The digital camera clicked normally, but when I pressed the shutter on the film camera, nothing happened. I checked the mechanism. Film was loaded correctly, battery showed full charge. But every time I tried to take a photograph, the camera refused to respond. The digital display that normally showed frame count now showed an error message I'd never seen before. Duplicate subject detected. The digital camera worked fine. I shot 3 rolls worth of images, covering every angle I'd attempted the previous day. But the film camera remained unresponsive, its error message persistent no matter how many times I reset the system. When I developed the digital images, they showed the spaces exactly as I'd seen them. Empty, atmospheric, perfectly desolate. No figure. No presence except my own shadow falling across institutional floors. But that night, my film camera began working again. I tested it with a roll of practice film in my apartment. Every shot captured perfectly. My living room, my desk, test exposures of various lighting conditions. The error message was gone. Until I tried to photograph myself. I set up a self-portrait in my bathroom mirror, using the camera's timer function. When I pressed the shutter release, the familiar error message appeared. Duplicate subject detected. The camera wouldn't fire. I covered the mirror with a towel and tried again. Same error. Moved to a different room, made sure no reflective surfaces were visible. The message persisted whenever I appeared in frame. According to the camera's logic, I was a duplicate. A copy of something that had already been photographed. I returned to Riverside one final time, bringing only the digital camera. I wanted to document the spaces where I'd encountered the anomaly, create a comprehensive record of what I'd experienced. But when I arrived, the building looked different. Construction crews had begun demolition work. The main entrance was blocked with safety barriers, and most of the windows I'd photographed were now boarded up. A site supervisor told me the project had been scheduled for months. They were surprised anyone had been inside recently, since the building had been sealed since spring. "You sure you were in this building?" he asked, checking his clipboard. "We've got security footage going back 6 months. Nobody's been inside except our assessment team." He showed me the footage on his tablet. Exterior cameras, interior motion sensors, thermal imaging from the structural survey. No record of anyone entering or leaving the building. No evidence of my 2 previous visits. But that night I found something I hadn't noticed before. In the metadata of my digital photographs, the GPS coordinates were slightly off. According to the camera, I'd been shooting half a mile east of Riverside State Hospital, in what satellite images showed as an empty field. I drove to those coordinates the next morning. Found nothing but overgrown grass and a concrete foundation that might once have supported a building. No architectural details, no broken windows, no institutional decay to photograph, just a historical marker placed by the county. Site of Riverside State Hospital, 1932-1975, demolished 1976. My film camera works perfectly now, except for one quirk. Sometimes, when I'm developing photographs from other locations, I find an extra image on the roll. Always the same composition. A figure in a hooded jacket standing in an empty corridor. Camera raised to photograph something beyond the frame. The timestamp shows these images were taken at Riverside, during the exact hours I spent shooting there. But the figure in the photograph is facing away from me, capturing angles I never attempted. Some subjects, I've learned, insist on taking their own pictures. They just need to borrow your equipment to do it. Condemned buildings make terrible neighbors, but they pay well for someone willing to watch them die slowly. Westfield Memorial Hospital had been closed for 3 years when I took the security contract. The state needed someone to patrol the property while they negotiated demolition permits and environmental assessments. 8 hours a night, 5 nights a week, walking the same route through corridors that smelled like disinfectant and abandonment. The pay was decent, the work was easy, and I didn't mind being alone. 23 years in private security had taught me that empty buildings were safer than occupied ones. No people meant no problems, just locks to check, logs to update, and the occasional phone call to dispatch confirming everything was quiet. My route never varied. Main entrance at 10 p.m., check the administrative wing, sweep the surgical floors, patrol the patient wards, back to the security desk by 2 a.m. for the first radio check. Repeat until 6 a.m. handoff to the day shift maintenance crew. Central to Unit 7, status report. Unit 7 to Central, all clear. Beginning second patrol. The same exchange every 2 hours, logged with precise timestamps in my security report. Dispatch was professional, efficient, rarely more than those basic status checks. Sometimes I recognized voices from other contracts. But mostly it was just routine radio protocol keeping me connected to the outside world. 3 weeks into the assignment, I started noticing small changes in the building. Doors I remembered locking would be found unlocked during my next patrol. Elevators with power disconnected would show call buttons glowing faintly in darkened shafts. Minor anomalies that I noted in my reports without much concern. Old buildings shift. Electrical systems develop quirks. Security work teaches you to distinguish between actual problems and the normal settling of abandoned spaces. But the night my radio started answering for itself, I knew something had shifted beyond normal building decay. I was completing my 2 a.m. patrol of Ward C when dispatch called for the scheduled check-in. I reached for my radio, but before I could respond, my own voice came through the speaker. Unit 7 to Central, all clear. Patrol completed without incident. I stood in the empty corridor, radio in hand, listening to myself report to dispatch in perfectly professional language. My voice, my cadence, even my habit of clearing my throat before each transmission. Copy, Unit 7. Next check at 0400 hours. Understood, Central. Unit 7 returning to normal patrol. The conversation concluded while I remained silent, watching my radio with growing unease. I hadn't transmitted anything, but dispatch had received my voice providing the exact status report I would have given. I tried calling back immediately. Central, Unit 7, did you copy my last transmission? Unit 7, Central copies your 0200 report. All clear, acknowledged. Is there an additional status to report? According to dispatch, I had already called in. Their logs would show my voice providing routine updates while I stood mute in an abandoned hospital corridor. The pattern continued over the following weeks. Every scheduled check-in was answered by my own voice before I could respond. The reports were accurate, always describing exactly what I had observed during my patrol, using language I might have chosen, delivered in my professional tone, but I wasn't making the calls. I started testing the phenomenon. During one patrol, I deliberately left a door unlocked that should have been secured. At the scheduled check-in, my radio voice reported, Unit 7 to Central, all clear. Minor security adjustment made on Ward B. Dr. 247 secured as per protocol. The voice had corrected my intentional error without my knowledge or participation. My written logs showed a similar strangeness. Each morning, I would find my incident report completely filled out in my own handwriting. Detailed notes about patrol times, door checks, any anomalies observed. The handwriting was unmistakably mine, the same pen pressure, the same abbreviated style I'd developed over years of security work. But I had no memory of writing the reports. The logs described my patrols with perfect accuracy, noting observations I had made but hadn't planned to document. They recorded my growing confusion about the radio responses, my attempts to test the system, even my decision to start a personal journal to track what was happening. That journal appeared in my patrol bag one morning, written in my handwriting, describing events from my perspective but with clinical detachment. The entries read like security reports filed on my own psychological state. Subject demonstrates increasing anxiety regarding routine communications. Behavior suggests awareness of automated response system, though subject continues normal patrol functions. No impact on security effectiveness observed. The final entry was dated 3 days in the future. Subject has adapted to dual operational status. Primary consciousness handles patrol duties while secondary handles communications and documentation. Integration complete. No further anomalies expected. I tried skipping work that night. Stayed home, unplugged my radio, left my security badge in a drawer. But at 2 a.m., my neighbor called asking why my work truck was in the driveway when I was supposed to be at the hospital. My truck was gone. According to my odometer, someone had driven my normal commute to Westfield Memorial and back. Dispatch logs for that night showed all routine check-ins completed by Unit 7. My voice, my reports, all filed under my employee ID number. The security company received my written patrol log the next morning, documenting a quiet night with no incidents. I called in sick for the rest of the week, but the patrols continued. Every night, someone wearing my ID badge walked my route, filed my reports, spoke with my voice to dispatchers who never questioned the consistency. When I finally returned to work, I found detailed logs describing my absence. Written in my handwriting, they noted, primary consciousness temporarily offline due to psychological adjustment period. Secondary operational protocols maintained full security coverage. No gaps in patrol schedule. The radio crackled as I stood reading my own documentation of events I hadn't experienced. Central to Unit 7, status report. I started to respond, but my voice was already answering. Unit 7 to Central, all clear. Primary operational consciousness has returned. Resuming standard patrol protocol. Some jobs, I've learned, become part of you whether you're present or not. The building needs watching, the reports need filing, and the radio checks continue every 2 hours like clockwork. I just stopped trying to remember which shift I'm actually working. Tommy found the entrance behind an overgrown utility shed, exactly where the archived blueprints said it would be. Millbrook State Hospital had been partially demolished in the 1980s, but the original psychiatric wing remained standing, condemned, sealed, and forgotten by everyone except urban exploration forums and historical preservation societies. We weren't vandals or thrill seekers. Our documentation work had been featured in architectural journals and historical societies. Every site we explored was photographed, measured, and researched with academic precision. The abandoned spaces we entered were treated as historical artifacts, deserving careful study, not playgrounds for teenage adventures. The psychiatric wing represented the perfect project. Built in 1923, it showcased institutional architecture from the era when mental health treatment was undergoing revolutionary changes. The building's original purpose had been humane for its time: private rooms instead of dormitories, natural light, therapeutic gardens. But by the 1970s, it had become a warehouse for patients the state couldn't properly treat or discharge. "Check this out," Tommy said, running his fingers along carved inscriptions in the corridor walls. "These aren't random graffiti. They're organized." He was right. The carvings formed deliberate patterns along the walls: coordinates, dates, fragments of text arranged in careful columns. Some were scratched into the plaster with fingernails. Others had been carved with improvised tools, creating deeper grooves that would survive decades of decay. 8267 Funda Green, 78.6928 degree Bree. Remember the garden, May 15, 1967. They said we could go home, Ward C room. 23. Listen for the singing. If you read this, you are already chosen, Lisa. Set up the laser measuring equipment while I photographed each inscription with precise documentation. Focal length, lighting conditions, exact positioning within the architectural space. This kind of historical graffiti was invaluable for understanding how patients had experienced these institutions. Tommy worked methodically through the longer text passages, reading each inscription aloud for our audio recording equipment. His voice echoed in the empty corridors as he documented patient names, treatment dates, fragments of poetry or prayer. Beyond the wall of sleep lies the garden where all questions are answered. He read from a passage near what had been the nurse's station. "Those who tend the garden never stop their work, even when the season ends." The inscription continued around a corner, the text becoming smaller and more tightly spaced, as if the writer had been running out of wall space. The gardeners remember every visitor's name. They prepare individual plots for each new arrival. The soil is rich with the memories of those who came before. No one leaves the garden unchanged. Tommy paused mid-sentence, his voice trailing off. Lisa and I looked up from our equipment, expecting him to continue. He stood motionless, staring at the wall with unfocused eyes. His mouth moved silently, as if he were trying to speak but couldn't find the words. "Tommy?" Lisa approached him carefully. "You okay?" He blinked and seemed to return to awareness, but when he spoke, his voice sounded different, flatter, more distant. "The coordinates," he said slowly. "They're not random. They're all here, in this building." I checked my GPS device. The coordinates Tommy had read were indeed precise locations within the hospital complex. Each inscription marked specific rooms, specific locations where something significant had occurred. We followed the first set of coordinates to a patient room on the second floor. The space was empty except for a rusted bed frame and the institutional sink that had supplied running water to this wing until the building's abandonment. But carved into the windowsill were more inscriptions, including fresh-looking text that hadn't been there when we'd entered hours earlier. Tommy Reeves. Arrived 3:47 p.m. November 15th. Lisa Chen. Photographic documentation specialist Michael Torres. Architectural measurements. They have come to tend the garden. Our names, our arrival time, our roles in the documentation project. Carved into stone that should have been weathered and aged, but looked as fresh as if someone had been chiseling while we worked downstairs. "Did we see anyone else enter the building?" Lisa asked, though we all knew the answer. We'd been alone, had secured the entrance behind us, and heard no other voices or footsteps. Tommy's behavior became increasingly strange as we continued the documentation. He would start reading an inscription aloud, then stop mid-sentence and stare blankly at the wall. When he resumed speaking, it was often to complete a different passage entirely, as if he were responding to text we couldn't see. Our digital audio recorder captured these sessions, but when we played them back, Tommy's voice sounded like it was layering, multiple versions of him speaking simultaneously, some reading the carved text, others adding commentary that wasn't coming from his lips. In one recording, his voice could be heard saying, "The garden needs tending. The documentation is important. Every visitor adds to the permanent collection." But Tommy was silent during that portion of the session, standing motionless while his recorded voice provided narration. By evening, he had stopped speaking entirely. He continued working, photographing inscriptions, taking measurements, making notes in his documentation journal, but he no longer responded to questions or acknowledged our presence. Lisa and I decided to leave. Whatever was affecting Tommy, removing him from the environment seemed like the safest approach. We packed our equipment and prepared to exit through the utility entrance we'd used to enter. That's when we found the problem. The entrance was sealed. Not locked or blocked, sealed. The door frame had been filled with concrete, as if it had never existed. The wall showed no sign of recent modification, no tool marks or fresh materials, just solid masonry where an opening had been hours earlier. We searched for alternate exits, but every door we'd seen was similarly sealed. Windows on the ground floor were barred and secured from outside. The building had apparently closed around us while we worked. Tommy seemed unconcerned by our predicament. He continued his documentation work, photographing walls and making notes with methodical precision. When I tried to get his attention, he looked at me with empty eyes and said, "The season is ending. The gardeners must complete their work." It was his voice, but the inflection was wrong, too formal, like he was reciting something he'd memorized. Our cell phones showed no signal. The GPS devices malfunctioned, showing our location as coordinates that didn't correspond to any real-world position. Even the time displays had become unreliable, showing different hours on different devices. That night, though, it was difficult to determine when night actually arrived since the windows showed only darkness. Lisa and I found fresh inscriptions appearing on walls we'd already documented. Our names were carved alongside patients from decades past. Our documentation project was described in detail, using terminology and observations we hadn't yet recorded in our own notes. The architects of memory. Urban exploration as historical preservation. Subject, Tommy Reeves exhibits. Full integration with site documentation protocols, subjects, Chen and Torres. Demonstrate increasing awareness of permanent residency requirements. The final inscription appeared above the sealed entrance we'd been searching for. Millbrook State Hospital, Psychiatric Wing, established. 1923, documentation ongoing current research. Staff, 47 permanent residents. Specialization, architectural memory preservation. Tommy's journal, which he continued updating despite his apparent catatonia, contained detailed notes about our integration process, written in his handwriting but using clinical language he'd never employed before. Day 1. Subjects respond positively to historical immersion. Documentation quality exceeds previous visitor standards. Day 3. Subject Reeves achieves full operational integration. Chen and Torres show resistance but continue productive work. Day 7. All subjects demonstrate value for permanent retention. Recommend upgrade to research staff status. Some explorations, I've learned, are designed to be one-way journeys. The buildings we document sometimes decide they need permanent curators, specialists who can tend to the architectural memory that accumulates in abandoned spaces. The work is important. Someone has to maintain the records of what happened here. Ensure the inscriptions are properly cataloged. Document each new arrival's contribution to the permanent collection. Lisa stopped asking about exits yesterday. She's begun photographing the new inscriptions with the same methodical precision we brought to our original project. We have all the time we need now to complete our documentation. The court order was routine. Exhume and identify remains from the institutional cemetery before the land could be transferred to private development. Riverside Psychiatric Hospital had operated from 1952 to 1983, and like most state institutions from that era, it maintained a potter's field for patients who died without family claims or proper burial funds. My office had handled similar cases before. Administrative oversight, incomplete records, families who'd lost track of institutionalized relatives during an era when mental health treatment was more about containment than care. The work was methodical, respectful, and necessary for legal closure. The cemetery occupied 2 acres behind the hospital's former location. Concrete markers bore only numbers, no names, no dates, just sequential identification that corresponded to burial records held by the state archives. Theoretically, each number linked to a patient file that would provide identification and next-of-kin information. In practice, the records were a disaster. Riverside's patient files had been transferred through 4 different state agencies during the facility's closure. Documents were missing, misfiled, or damaged by decades of inadequate storage. The cemetery records showed 247 numbered graves, but we could only locate patient files for 183 of them. That's where the audit became complicated. Dr. Patterson, we have a problem with the identification numbers. My assistant, Jennifer Walsh, had been cross-referencing the cemetery markers with patient records when she discovered the discrepancy. The numbers carved into the concrete markers weren't just patient identification codes. They were hospital employee ID numbers, current ones, matching staff who were still actively working at various state facilities. I reviewed her findings personally. Grave marker 447291 corresponded to Jennifer's own employee ID. Marker 773829 matched mine. Every numbered headstone in the cemetery connected to a current state employee, including people who had never worked at Riverside during its operational years. Check the database again, I told her. There's been some kind of clerical error. But when Jennifer accessed the personnel files, each employee record showed 2 entries, one for their current position and another listing them as a deceased patient at Riverside Psychiatric Hospital. The death dates varied, but all fell between 1978 and 1983, the facility's final operational years. According to the state's official records, we had all died at Riverside decades before we were born. I contacted the state archives to request the original burial documentation. What I received instead was a complete forensic report on my own autopsy, dated April 15, 1981, signed by a medical examiner I'd never heard of. The report detailed my cause of death as institutional complications following extended care, noted identifying marks that matched my actual physical characteristics, and included dental records that were identical to my current dental work. The signature at the bottom was mine, my handwriting, my credentials, my professional seal. But the document predated my birth by 3 years. Jennifer's autopsy report was similarly impossible. Dated 1979, it described her death from therapeutic complications and included fingerprints that matched her current employment records. The attending physician was listed as herself, with her current medical license number and signature. I ordered DNA analysis of remains from both graves. The results were unambiguous. The skeletal remains in grave 447291 were genetically identical to Jennifer. The remains in grave 773829 matched my own DNA profile perfectly. We had found our own bodies, buried in graves that predated our birth. With autopsy reports we had apparently performed on ourselves, the forensic team expanded the exhumation to include all 247 graves. Each set of remains corresponded exactly to a current state employee. Doctors, administrators, clerks, maintenance staff. All of us had apparently died at Riverside decades before we began our careers. But that wasn't the most disturbing discovery. The patient files we couldn't locate initially, they began appearing in our office filing system. Not delivered by archives or transferred from other agencies. They simply materialized in cabinet drawers that had been empty the day before. Each file contained detailed treatment records for the employee whose remains we'd identified. My patient file described a 30-year career in forensic pathology, followed by institutionalization for severe delusional disorder characterized by obsessive examination of deceased subjects. The treatment notes were written in handwriting I recognized as my own, documenting my gradual deterioration as I became convinced that I was performing autopsies on my own body. The final entry in my file was dated yesterday. Patient demonstrates complete integration with institutional memory. Recommend continuation of current treatment protocol. Patient's forensic expertise remains valuable for facility operations. Jennifer's file told a similar story. According to the records, she had been institutionalized for compulsive record-keeping disorder after becoming obsessed with cross-referencing patient files with cemetery records. Her treatment notes described increasing delusions about working as a medical examiner's assistant, performing DNA analysis on her own remains. Each employee who worked on the exhumation project had a corresponding patient file. The records documented our current jobs as elaborate therapeutic delusions, carefully maintained to provide structure for long-term psychiatric patients who had never actually left Riverside. The files noted that our employment at various state agencies was part of an experimental treatment program, allowing institutionalized patients to maintain detailed fantasy careers while remaining under medical supervision. Our paychecks, our families, our professional accomplishments, all carefully constructed illusions designed to keep chronic patients stable and productive. He tried contacting colleagues outside the exhumation project, but discovered I had no personal contacts beyond the people working on this case. My phone contained numbers for other state employees, all of whom also had graves in Riverside Cemetery. My apartment lease was signed by the hospital's chief administrator. My professional licenses were issued by boards composed entirely of staff from our exhumation team. The forensic report I was preparing became increasingly difficult to complete. Every time I attempted to document our findings, the computer would auto-correct my work, replacing objective analysis with patient assessment notes. My professional observations about the remains became psychiatric evaluations of my own mental state. Subject Patterson continues to demonstrate productive engagement with forensic analysis delusion. Recommend continued reinforcement of professional identity fantasy to maintain therapeutic progress. Jennifer stopped coming to work after we found her patient file. When I called her apartment, a hospital administrator answered and informed me that patient Walsh is experiencing temporary adjustment, difficulties with her employment therapy program, and would be receiving enhanced treatment until she can resume her medical examiner assistant role. I drove to her apartment complex, but the address led to a wing of Riverside Psychiatric Hospital. The building that I thought had been demolished in 1983 was fully operational, complete with current state licensing and an active patient population. My office, which I believed was located in the county courthouse, was actually a converted patient room in Riverside's medical wing. The filing cabinets containing our case files were patient record storage. The examination tables where we'd analyzed the exhumed remains were therapy equipment for patients whose treatment involved elaborate role-playing exercises. The exhumation site was visible from my window, if it could be called exhumation, when we'd been digging up graves in the hospital's courtyard, supervised by medical staff who'd been documenting our therapeutic progress throughout the entire project. My final report is due tomorrow, though I'm no longer certain whether it's a forensic analysis or a patient assessment. The template keeps changing as I type, shifting between official case documentation and psychiatric evaluation forms. The cemetery records have been updated to show that the exhumation project is complete. All remains have been properly identified and next of kin notified. The medical examiner's office will file its report with the state archives, where it will be stored alongside the treatment records of the patients who performed the analysis. Some investigations, I've learned, are designed to examine the investigator rather than the evidence. The bodies we found were real, the DNA analysis was accurate, and the identification was correct. We just hadn't realized we were identifying ourselves as both the living and the dead. The contract was simple: aerial documentation of Brookhaven State Hospital for environmental remediation planning. 6 hours of drone work, high-resolution photography of the complex from multiple angles, ground-penetrating radar mapping of potential contamination sites. Standard documentation work that I'd performed at dozens of abandoned industrial sites. Brookhaven had been closed since 1978, leaving behind a sprawling complex of brick buildings arranged around a central courtyard. The state needed comprehensive visual records before beginning asbestos abatement and soil testing. My drone, equipped with 4K cameras and LiDAR mapping, could capture every detail from angles that ground-based photography couldn't reach. I launched from the main parking area at dawn, when the light would provide optimal contrast for architectural photography. The DJI Matrice 300 climbed smoothly to 200 feet, its stabilized camera system capturing crisp footage of the hospital's deteriorating facades. Through the controller's screen, the complex looked exactly as expected: broken windows, vegetation growing through cracks in the pavement, roof lines sagging from decades of weather damage. I worked methodically through my flight plan, capturing overlapping shots that would allow the environmental team to create detailed 3D models of the structures. That's when I noticed the figure in the courtyard. A person stood motionless in the center of the open space, looking directly up at the drone. Dark clothing, arms at their sides, face turned toward the camera with unmistakable intentionality. Someone was watching me work. I adjusted the camera angle for a closer look, zooming in on the figure while maintaining the drone's position. Through the high-resolution display, I could see more details. A hooded jacket, worn jeans, boots that looked designed for outdoor work. The person's face was partially shadowed by the hood, but their posture indicated full awareness of being observed. This was a problem. The site was supposed to be secured, and my contract required documentation of any unauthorized personnel. I captured several close-up shots of the figure before maneuvering the drone to maintain visual contact while I called site security. But when I looked back at the controller screen, the figure had moved, not walked away, moved. Relocated to a different position in the courtyard without any transition visible on camera. One moment standing near the main entrance, the next positioned beside an old fountain at the courtyard's far end. Still motionless, still looking up at the drone, I reviewed the footage in real time. The timestamp showed continuous recording, but the figure's position had changed between frames with no visible movement. Like watching someone teleport in small increments across the courtyard. I completed the exterior documentation and moved to interior shots through broken windows. Several rooms remained partially furnished, rusted bed frames, overturned wheelchairs, administrative desks covered with decades of debris. The drone's cameras could capture these spaces from angles that would be impossible for ground-based photographers. The figure appeared in these interior shots as well, standing in patient rooms, positioned beside windows, always oriented toward the drone's camera. The same person, same clothing, same purposeful stillness. But now inside the building I'd watched them occupy in the courtyard moments earlier. Frame-by-frame analysis revealed the pattern. In every photograph containing the figure, they were positioned to maintain direct visual contact with the drone. When I photographed room 237 from the east window, the figure stood facing east. When I captured room 315 from the south exposure, they had relocated to face south, whoever this was. They were tracking my flight path with impossible precision. I landed the drone to review the footage more carefully. The 4K resolution allowed for detailed analysis of individual frames, and what I found was disturbing. In the close-up shots of the figure's face, I could see features that looked familiar. The bone structure, the set of the jaw, the particular way the hood cast shadows across the cheekbones. The person in the footage looked like me. Not identical. The clothing was different, the posture more rigid than my normal bearing. But the facial features, the physical proportions, even the stance all suggested someone who shared my general appearance. Like seeing myself in a funhouse mirror that made subtle but unmistakable alterations. I examined the metadata from each photograph. The GPS coordinates were precise, showing exact positioning within the Brookhaven complex. But the timestamps revealed an impossibility. Several shots were recorded simultaneously from different locations, as if multiple drones had been operating in coordination. The controller's memory banks showed only one flight path, one operator, one drone registration. But the footage suggested multiple aerial platforms capturing synchronized documentation of the same figure from complementary angles. When I uploaded the data to my laptop for final processing, the analysis software detected motion artifacts in the supposedly static shots. The figure wasn't truly motionless. They were making minor adjustments to maintain camera contact as the drone's position shifted. Micro-movements that suggested active tracking rather than coincidental positioning. But the most disturbing discovery was in the final frame of footage. As I prepared to conclude the documentation session, I captured one last wide shot of the complex from 300 feet altitude. The figure stood in the courtyard, but for the first time, they weren't looking up at the drone. They were looking down at something in their hands, a drone controller. Identical to the one I was operating, held in the same position I maintained during flight operations. The figure was piloting their own aerial platform, coordinating their movements based on camera feedback from their own perspective, I was watching myself watch myself through cameras operated by someone who looked exactly like me but occupied a building I had never entered. The flight log, stored on my controller, showed a second operator profile that hadn't existed when I began the session. Same name, same certification numbers, same equipment registration. But the operational history showed flights dating back years, all at the Brookhaven complex, all following identical documentation patterns. According to the system logs, I had been conducting aerial surveys of this abandoned hospital every week for the past 3 years. When I returned home and processed the final footage, I found additional material that hadn't been visible during the live flight. Shots of the complex from angles I hadn't attempted, captured with my equipment, but showing perspectives I had never seen through the controller. The figure appeared in these shots as well, but now they were looking directly at the camera with an expression I recognized. It was the same focused concentration I maintained during complex flight operations, the particular intensity I brought to challenging documentation work. Some aerial surveys, I've learned, require coordination between multiple perspectives to capture the complete picture. The buildings we're documenting sometimes provide their own camera operators, specialists who understand the site from angles we can't achieve alone. The footage is remarkably comprehensive. Between my documentation and theirs, we captured every detail the environmental team requested. The soil samples from Pinehurst showed standard contamination patterns for institutional sites, elevated lead levels from old paint, traces of pharmaceutical compounds leached from waste disposal, minor petroleum products from heating systems. Nothing unexpected for a psychiatric hospital that had operated from 1947 to 1985. My team was conducting Phase 2 environmental site assessment work, documenting soil and groundwater conditions before the property could be cleared for residential development. Standard procedure: drill core samples, analyze chemical composition, map contamination plumes, recommend remediation strategies. The job was routine until my equipment started reading biological signatures in soil that had been undisturbed for decades. I first noticed the anomaly while testing samples from the area behind the former isolation ward. My handheld spectrometer, designed to measure chemical concentrations in parts per million, began displaying readings I'd never seen before. Instead of heavy metal values, the screen showed patterns that resembled vital signs. Heart rate, 72 BPM, blood pressure, 120/80, body temperature, 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit. Recalibrated the device and tested a different sample. Same results. The spectrometer insisted it was analyzing living tissue instead of contaminated soil, providing biometric data with the precision it normally reserved for chemical analysis. Dr. Martinez, are you seeing this? My research partner, Dr. Sarah Kim, was experiencing similar readings from her equipment. Her gas chromatograph, which typically identified volatile organic compounds, was producing spectrograms that matched human respiratory patterns. Her moisture meters were detecting hydration levels consistent with living biological systems. We were getting life signs from dirt. The readings weren't random. As we moved our sampling grid closer to the hospital buildings, the biometric signatures became stronger and more complex. Near the main administration building, my spectrometer detected multiple overlapping heart rates. The soil around the former patient wards showed brainwave patterns that resembled EEG readings from active neural tissue. By noon, our instruments were providing complete medical profiles for each sample site. Blood chemistry panels, metabolic rates, even psychological assessment data that our equipment had no capacity to generate. The soil beneath Pinehurst wasn't just contaminated. According to our readings, it was alive. Sarah suggested equipment failure, but our instruments were functioning perfectly for control samples taken from uncontaminated reference sites. The anomalous readings appeared only when testing soil from within the hospital complex boundaries. That afternoon, I discovered the correlation between our biometric readings and the hospital's patient records. The state archives had provided historical documentation as part of our environmental assessment, patient admissions, treatment protocols, mortality records. When I cross-referenced the biometric data from our soil samples with patient files, I found exact matches. Sample site 23A, located near the former room 147, showed vital signs identical to those recorded for patient number 4471 during his admission in 1963. heart rate, blood pressure, even medication metabolites in the soil matched the medical records of someone who had died at Pinehurst 23 years before the hospital closed. Sample site 31C corresponded to patient 7329, a woman whose treatment records documented the exact neurological patterns our equipment was detecting in soil outside her former room. The brainwave signatures we measured matched EEG readings from her psychiatric evaluations, preserved in sediment that had never been disturbed. Each soil sample connected to a specific patient, as if the ground had retained some biological imprint of everyone who had lived and died at the hospital. The phenomenon extended beyond individual readings. In areas where patient wards had housed multiple residents, our instruments detected overlapping biometric signatures, dozens of heart rates beating in complex polyrhythms, brainwave patterns layered like geological strata, respiratory cycles that created harmonic breathing patterns in contaminated earth. Sarah's psychological assessment readings were particularly disturbing. Her spectrometer, somehow generating psychiatric evaluation data from soil chemistry, indicated that the patients whose biometric signatures we were detecting remained conscious and aware. The psychological profiles suggested ongoing mental activity, continued responses to therapeutic interventions that had ended decades earlier. According to our instruments, the former patients of Pinehurst were still receiving treatment, their vital signs stable, their psychiatric conditions underactive, management by medical protocols embedded in the contaminated soil. That's when I realized my own biometric signature was appearing in our readings. Sample site 45D, taken from soil near the main entrance, showed vital signs that matched my current medical records. Heart rate, blood pressure, medication levels from my prescription allergy medication, all detected in soil I had never touched except through sample collection procedures. Sarah's readings appeared similarly. The soil we were testing contained evidence of our biological presence, our current health status, even our psychological profiles generated through unknown analytical processes. The contaminated earth was incorporating us into its biological inventory as we worked. Our final day of sampling revealed the extent of the phenomenon. The soil contamination wasn't limited to heavy metals and pharmaceutical residues. The earth around Pinehurst had absorbed and preserved the biological essence of everyone who had spent significant time at the institution, patients, staff, visitors, and now environmental scientists conducting site assessment work. My handheld spectrometer began providing treatment recommendations based on the biometric data it was collecting. Medication adjustments, therapy protocols, dietary modifications, all displayed on equipment designed to measure soil chemistry, but now functioning as sophisticated medical diagnostic systems. The recommendations were professionally sound. The medication adjustments reflected current best practices for the conditions the spectrometer had diagnosed from our biological signatures. The therapy protocols matched contemporary psychiatric treatment standards. Our contaminated soil samples were practicing medicine. When we submitted our environmental assessment report, the laboratory analysis confirmed our field readings. The soil around Pinehurst contained elevated levels of standard institutional contaminants, but also complex biological compounds that resembled preserved human tissue samples. The lab recommended additional testing to identify the source of the biological contamination. They suggested that the hospital might have disposed of medical waste improperly, creating underground repositories of organic material that were somehow maintaining biological activity decades after disposal. But I knew the truth was more complex. The soil wasn't contaminated with biological waste. It had become a biological system. The earth around Pinehurst functioned as a vast, distributed organism that preserved and sustained the life patterns of everyone who had been part of the hospital community. Our equipment continued providing biometric readings even after we left the site. My spectrometer, now permanently calibrated to detect life signs instead of chemical compounds, showed my vital signs increasing in frequency and complexity each time I reviewed our data. Sarah's instruments displayed similar patterns. We were becoming more biologically complex, our life signs more integrated with the readings we'd collected from Pinehurst's contaminated soil. Some environmental contamination, I've learned, works in both directions. While we were measuring the biological signatures embedded in institutional soil, that same soil was measuring us, incorporating our vital signs into its underground medical records. The remediation recommendations in our final report suggested leaving the contamination undisturbed. Some biological systems are too complex to remove safely, too integrated to separate from their environment. The soil will continue practicing medicine, monitoring the vital signs of patients who never truly left treatment, and now it has our biometric signatures to work with as well. The assignment seemed straightforward. Spend a week at the abandoned Eastwood State Hospital documenting any environmental or psychological factors that might explain the supernatural phenomena reported by previous contractors. Standard consultation work that I'd performed at other institutional sites where redevelopment projects had been disrupted by worker complaints about haunting activity. As a clinical psychiatrist with 15 years of experience in institutional environments, I understood how abandoned hospitals could trigger psychological responses in susceptible individuals. The combination of institutional architecture, historical trauma, and suggestible group dynamics created perfect conditions for collective anxiety manifestations that workers interpreted as paranormal activity. My methodology was clinical and systematic. Document environmental factors that might influence psychological state, lighting conditions, acoustic properties, air quality issues. Interview workers who had reported unusual experiences. Provide rational explanations for phenomena that seemed supernatural to untrained observers. Eastwood had operated as a state psychiatric facility from 1952 to 1987, housing up to 800 patients during its peak capacity years. The buildings were typical institutional design, long corridors, high ceilings, repetitive room layouts that created the disorienting anonymity characteristic of mid-century mental health facilities. I established my temporary office in the former administrative wing, using portable lighting and a battery-powered recording system to document my observations. The space felt familiar. Despite decades of abandonment, it retained the particular atmosphere of psychiatric institutions where I'd spent my entire career. My first 3 days followed standard protocol. I walked through patient wards, therapy rooms, and common areas, noting architectural features that might contribute to reported haunting experiences. The building's acoustic properties were particularly significant. Sounds echoed and carried in ways that could easily be misinterpreted as voices or footsteps by anxious workers. On the 4th day, I began hearing voices myself, not the whispered fragments or indistinct murmurs typically reported in these environments. Clear, professional dialogue that seemed to originate from therapy sessions occurring in adjacent rooms. I could distinguish individual voices, patients describing symptoms, therapists providing clinical responses, group sessions with multiple participants discussing treatment goals. I followed the voices through the building, tracking their apparent source from room to room. But every space I entered was empty, showing no evidence of recent occupancy. The conversations continued around me, always seeming to come from the next room, the corridor just beyond hearing range. That evening, I reviewed my audio recordings to document the psychological factors that might have triggered auditory hallucinations. Instead, I found perfectly clear recordings of therapy sessions that I had no memory of conducting. My voice, unmistakably, providing professional psychiatric consultation to patients whose responses were equally clear on the recording. Hour-long sessions where I offered clinical analysis, medication recommendations, and therapeutic interventions to individuals who participated in detailed discussions about their treatment progress. The recordings were time-stamped during periods when I remembered being alone in empty rooms, taking notes on environmental observations. I played the recordings repeatedly, analyzing the content for psychological significance. The therapy sessions followed standard clinical protocols, intake assessments, progress evaluations, treatment planning meetings. My voice demonstrated the professional competence and therapeutic rapport I'd developed over years of psychiatric practice. But I had no memory of these patients, no recollection of the conversations, no awareness of conducting therapy sessions while believing I was documenting environmental factors. The patient voices were equally professional in their responses. They demonstrated insight into their conditions, compliance with medication regimens, progress toward therapeutic goals. These were not the confused or resistant responses typical of severe psychiatric illness, but the engaged participation of patients who were actively involved in their treatment. The recorded sessions included names, case numbers, and specific treatment details that allowed me to cross-reference with Eastwood's historical patient records. Every patient whose voice appeared on my recordings had been treated at the hospital, but all had died during their institutionalization, some from medical complications, others from the inevitable progression of untreatable conditions. I was conducting ongoing therapy with patients who had been dead for decades. The phenomenon escalated on my 5th day. Instead of hearing therapy sessions from adjacent rooms, I began participating in them consciously. Patients would arrive at my temporary office for scheduled appointments, introduce themselves with familiar professionalism, and engage in detailed discussions about their ongoing treatment. Mrs. Dorothy Harrison, admitted to Eastwood in 1963 for treatment-resistant depression, discussed her response to new medication protocols we'd apparently been adjusting over several sessions. Her symptoms were improving, she reported, and she was looking forward to discharge planning once her family situation stabilized. Mr. Robert Chen spoke about his progress in group therapy sessions, describing insights he'd gained about managing his anxiety disorder through cognitive behavioral techniques we'd been practicing together. He was particularly grateful for my patience in helping him develop coping strategies that had significantly improved his daily functioning. Each patient demonstrated remarkable therapeutic progress, showing the kind of improvement that institutional psychiatry in the 1960s and 70s had rarely achieved. Their conditions were stabilizing, their symptoms were manageable, and their prognosis for community reintegration was excellent. According to my appointment book, which I found filled with my handwriting despite having no memory of making the entries, I was managing a caseload of 37 patients, all former residents of Eastwood who had continued their treatment beyond their biological deaths. The therapy sessions were remarkably effective. Patients who had died of untreatable psychiatric conditions were achieving therapeutic breakthroughs that contemporary medicine couldn't provide during their lifetimes. Depression was responding to medication combinations that hadn't existed during their era. Anxiety disorders were managed through behavioral interventions that were still experimental when these patients were alive. My clinical notes documented decades of continuous treatment, chronicling gradual but consistent improvement in patients whose conditions had been considered hopeless by the medical standards of their time. The therapy had continued without interruption, administered by a series of psychiatrists who had apparently included me without my conscious awareness. On my final day, I attempted to conduct discharge evaluations for patients who had achieved sufficient therapeutic progress to warrant release from ongoing treatment. But when I opened their files to complete the necessary paperwork, I found my own intake assessment, patient Dr. Michael. Torres date of admission, current admitting diagnosis, delusional disorder with occupational themes. Treatment plan, integration with ongoing therapeutic community, the E. File described my arrival at Eastwood as part of a treatment program for professionals who had developed psychiatric symptoms related to their clinical work. My belief that I was conducting an environmental assessment was documented as a therapeutic delusion designed to ease my transition into the patient community. According to the clinical notes written in my own handwriting, I had been institutionalized for severe reality dissociation characterized by persistent beliefs about working as an independent consultant. My family had committed me after I'd become unable to distinguish between my professional fantasies and actual psychiatric treatment. The notes documented my excellent progress in therapy. I was responding well to the structured environment, participating actively in treatment sessions, and demonstrating remarkable insight into my condition. My delusion about conducting environmental assessments was being managed through careful reality orientation that allowed me to maintain therapeutic engagement while gradually accepting my status as a patient. My discharge evaluation, scheduled for the following week, indicated readiness for transition to outpatient care. The therapeutic community at Eastwood had provided the intensive treatment I needed to achieve stability. I could now return to community living with appropriate medication management and follow-up therapy. The final entry in my file was written in the familiar clinical style I'd developed over years of psychiatric practice. Patient Torres has achieved full integration with treatment goals. Delusional content regarding environmental consultation has resolved. Recommend discharge to community placement with ongoing therapeutic support. Some psychiatric evaluations, I've learned, examine the evaluator more thoroughly than the subject. The therapy sessions I thought I was analyzing were actually part of my own treatment, conducted by colleagues who understood that the most effective intervention was allowing me to practice the profession I missed while accepting the care I needed. The environmental assessment I submitted to the developers recommended against disturbing the institutional environment at Eastwood. Some therapeutic communities, I concluded, function too effectively to risk interruption through redevelopment. The treatment is working remarkably well, both for the long-term patients who have achieved stability they never experienced in life, and for the newer admissions who are learning to integrate their professional identity with their therapeutic needs. Thank you, Doctor. You may discharge now. The blueprints were straightforward when I started. Crescent Hills Hospital, built in 1961, standard institutional architecture with predictable structural elements. Two-story main building, single-story wings extending east and west, basement utilities. The kind of building I'd mapped dozens of times for renovation assessment projects. My job was simple: create accurate architectural drawings that would allow the development team to determine renovation costs versus demolition savings. Standard structural engineering work that I'd been performing for 12 years without unusual complications. I began with the main building, using laser measurement tools to verify room dimensions and load-bearing wall locations. The interior matched the historical plans perfectly, corridors measuring exactly as documented, room layouts conforming to original specifications, structural elements positioned where the 1961 blueprints indicated they should be. My computer-aided design system recorded measurements with millimeter precision, generating floor plans that would serve as the foundation for all renovation planning. Clean, accurate, professional documentation that met industry standards for architectural analysis. But when I returned the next morning, my blueprints had changed. The main corridor, which I'd measured at 12 feet wide, now showed 14 feet on my CAD drawings. The east wing, originally terminating at the former pharmacy, extended an additional 40 feet to include rooms that hadn't existed in my measurements. The basement plans showed a sub-basement level that I'd never accessed or documented. I assumed software error and restored the files from my backup system. The measurements I'd recorded were still accurate in my field notes. And I spent the morning re-entering the correct dimensions into my CAD program. By evening, I had recreated the original blueprints with careful attention to precision. Every measurement verified, every structural element properly positioned, every room accurately documented according to my field observations. The next morning, the drawings had expanded again. Not just dimensional changes, entirely new architectural elements. Staircases leading to floors that didn't exist. Elevator shafts connecting to basements I'd never mapped. Corridors extending into wings that weren't part of the original hospital complex. The new elements weren't random additions. They followed architectural logic, connecting sensibly to existing structural systems. The additional staircases aligned with load-bearing walls. The extended corridors maintained proper fire egress spacing. The new basement levels included appropriate utility connections. Someone with professional architectural knowledge was modifying my blueprints with technically sound design decisions. I checked the software logs for unauthorized access. No external connections, no shared network activity, no evidence of another user modifying the files. The changes appeared to be generated by the CAD system itself, as if the software was continuing my architectural analysis independently. To test the phenomenon, I deliberately introduced errors into my blueprints, walls that intersected incorrectly, rooms with impossible dimensions, structural elements that violated building codes. I saved the files and left detailed notes documenting the intentional mistakes. The next morning, all errors had been corrected. The walls now aligned properly, room dimensions conformed to architectural standards, and structural elements met current building codes. My intentional mistakes had been professionally edited by unknown expertise. But the corrections weren't simply reversions to my original measurements. The blueprints now showed improvements to the hospital's design: better traffic flow patterns, more efficient room layouts, structural modifications that would enhance the building's functionality. The basement plans revealed the most significant changes. What I'd documented as a simple utility basement now showed multiple sub-levels extending deep underground. Treatment facilities, patient housing, administrative areas, an entire underground complex that would triple the hospital's capacity. The drawings included detailed specifications for HVAC systems, electrical layouts, plumbing schematics, and structural support calculations. Professional-grade architectural documentation that would have required months of engineering work to produce. Verified the underground additions by returning to the building with ground-penetrating radar equipment. The radar confirmed structural elements exactly where the modified blueprints indicated they should be. Foundation walls, floor slabs, utility conduits, all matching the dimensions shown in drawings I'd never created. Crescent Hills Hospital was larger than I'd realized. My initial measurements had documented only the visible portions of a complex that extended significantly underground. But when I attempted to access the sub-basement levels indicated on my blueprints, I couldn't locate the entrances. The staircases shown in the drawings led to doors that opened onto solid walls. The elevator shafts terminated at floor levels that didn't correspond to actual floors. The architectural modifications existed in my blueprints, but not in the physical building. That changed on my final day of documentation. I arrived to find construction scaffolding throughout the hospital, as if renovation work had begun overnight. Workers in hard hats moved through corridors that had been empty the previous day, following blueprints that matched my modified CAD drawings. "Morning, Mr. Peterson," called a foreman I'd never met. "The foundation work is proceeding on schedule. Should have the new basement levels accessible by next week." I checked my project files. According to my documentation, I'd been managing the Crescent Hills renovation project for 8 months, overseeing structural modifications that would convert the abandoned hospital into a fully operational medical facility. My blueprints showed construction progress reports, building permit approvals, contractor coordination schedules, all documented in my professional style, but describing work I had no memory of supervising. The renovation was following my architectural plans precisely. Workers were excavating the sub-basement levels I'd discovered in my drawings, installing the structural modifications I'd apparently designed, creating the improved room layouts my CAD system had generated overnight. When I asked the foreman about the project timeline, he showed me schedules in my handwriting that detailed completion phases extending through the next year. My signature appeared on contractor agreements, permit applications, and safety protocols for renovation work I'd never planned. The final blueprint in my files showed the completed project. Crescent Hills Hospital restored to full operational capacity, with modern updates that preserved the architectural integrity of the original design, while expanding functionality to serve contemporary medical needs. My name appeared as the project architect, credited with designing renovation solutions that seamlessly integrated historical preservation with technical innovation. Some structural analysis, I've learned, reveals that buildings possess their own architectural intentions. The blueprints document not just what exists, but what structures aspire to become once someone with proper engineering expertise helps them realize their full potential. The construction is proceeding excellently. The workers are skilled, the materials are quality, and the structural modifications will create a facility that exceeds original design specifications. I should be proud of the architectural solutions we've developed together. The volunteer coordinator was apologetic about the assignment. "Most people prefer the outdoor cleanup projects," she explained, handing me a clipboard with safety waivers and work schedules. "But Willowbrook needs interior clearing before the demolition crew can begin. Just debris removal, nothing complicated." I'd signed up for community service to fulfill court-ordered requirements after a minor traffic violation. 40 hours of volunteer work seemed preferable to traffic school, and helping with urban renewal projects felt more meaningful than picking up highway litter. Willowbrook State Hospital had closed in 1994, leaving behind a complex of buildings in various stages of decay. The city's redevelopment plan called for demolishing the structures and converting the land into affordable housing. But first, the buildings needed to be cleared of debris, hazardous materials, and anything that might complicate the demolition process. The volunteer work was scheduled for weekends, 8-hour shifts with small groups assigned to different buildings. I was the only person who volunteered for the East Wing, a 4-story structure that had housed administrative offices and patient records during the hospital's operational years. The building's interior was exactly what I expected from an abandoned institutional facility. Broken furniture, scattered paperwork, debris from ceiling tiles and deteriorating plaster. Years of water damage, vandalism, and simple neglect had left most rooms cluttered with the kind of institutional detritus that accumulates when buildings are abandoned rather than properly decommissioned. My job was straightforward. Fill wheeled debris containers, transport them to the designated dumpster area, repeat until the rooms were cleared. Physical work that was satisfying in its simplicity, visible progress measured in emptied rooms and filled containers. I started with the first floor offices, working systematically through spaces that had once housed social workers, administrators, and patient coordinators. Each room contained decades' worth of abandoned office supplies, broken furniture, and paperwork too damaged to be worth preserving. The work was meditative. Load debris, wheel container to dumpster, return for next load. By noon, I'd cleared 3 offices completely, their floors swept clean and ready for demolition. The visible progress was rewarding, transforming cluttered, depressing spaces into empty rooms that could be properly demolished and recycled. But when I returned the following weekend, the rooms I'd cleared were filled with debris again, not just littered with new trash or damaged by vandalism, completely restored to their previous state of abandonment. The same broken furniture, the same scattered paperwork, the same patterns of ceiling debris that I'd carefully removed the previous week. I assumed other volunteers had been assigned to the same building and had somehow moved debris from upper floors down into the spaces I'd cleared. The volunteer coordinator confirmed that I was the only person assigned to the East Wing, but suggested that weather damage or structural settling might have caused debris to shift into areas I'd already cleaned. I started over, working more systematically to track exactly what I was removing from each room. I photographed spaces before and after clearing, documenting the type and quantity of debris to verify my progress between work sessions. The second weekend, I cleared 6 rooms completely, documenting every load of debris I transported to the dumpster area. The photographs showed dramatic before and after comparisons. Cluttered offices transformed into empty spaces, ready for demolition. When I returned the third weekend, all 6 rooms had been refilled with debris. But reviewing my photographs revealed something disturbing. The debris patterns were identical to my before pictures from 2 weeks earlier. Not just similar types of trash and broken furniture, but exactly the same arrangement of objects in precisely the same positions. Someone was restoring the building to its previous state of abandonment with meticulous attention to detail. I confronted the volunteer coordinator about the situation. She reviewed the work schedules and confirmed that no other volunteers had been assigned to the East Wing. Security guards patrolled the complex nightly, and their logs showed no unauthorized access to the building I was clearing. "Maybe you're working too hard," she suggested diplomatically. "These old buildings can be depressing. Sometimes volunteers think they've accomplished more than they actually have." But I had photographs documenting my work, timestamps showing exactly when debris was removed, and clear evidence that my cleanup efforts were being systematically undone between work sessions. The fourth weekend, I decided to monitor the building's condition more carefully. Instead of clearing entire rooms, I removed specific objects from various locations, photographing their absence and noting their exact original positions. If someone was restoring debris patterns, I would document exactly how they were doing it. I removed a broken office chair from room 147, a damaged filing cabinet from room 152, and a pile of water-damaged paperwork from room 165. Each removal was photographed and timed, with precise documentation of where each object had been positioned before I moved it to the dumpster. That evening, I returned to the building with a flashlight to check whether my removed objects had been replaced. The security guards didn't patrol the interior after dark, leaving several hours when unauthorized restoration could occur without detection. Room 147 was exactly as I'd left it, the broken office chair removed, the space clearly empty. Room 152 still showed the gap where the damaged filing cabinet had stood. Room 165 maintained the clean area where I'd removed the water-damaged paperwork. But when I checked the dumpster area, the objects I'd removed weren't there. The broken chair, the damaged cabinet, the pile of paperwork, none of the debris I'd transported appeared in the dumpster where I'd placed it hours earlier. Someone was removing objects from the disposal area and returning them to their original positions while I worked. The fifth weekend, I stayed in the building continuously, taking breaks, but never leaving the East Wing unattended. I wanted to catch whoever was undoing my work, document their methods, and understand why anyone would want to maintain an abandoned hospital in a state of institutional decay. As I worked through the morning, I became aware of sounds from other parts of the building. Footsteps in corridors, the squeak of wheeled containers, the rustle of debris being moved. Other people were working in the building, following the same cleanup routine I was performing. I followed the sounds, tracking them through corridors and up stairwells. But every room I entered was empty, showing no evidence of recent activity. The sounds continued around me, always seeming to come from adjacent spaces that revealed no workers when I investigated. That afternoon, I found my name carved into the dust on a windowsill in room 183, not scratched into the glass, but traced in the accumulated grime with finger pressure that created clear lettering. David Chen, Volunteer Coordinator, Permanent Assignment. Below my name was a date from next week, as if someone was documenting my future work schedule in advance. The carved message included details about my volunteer assignment that I'd never provided to anyone. My court-ordered community service requirement, my preference for working alone, my systematic approach to debris removal. Someone had been observing my work methods and documenting my progress with administrative precision. When I finished my shift that evening, the volunteer coordinator thanked me for my exceptional dedication to the project. "The East Wing has never looked better," she said, reviewing photos of my work area. "You've made remarkable progress." But her photos showed the building exactly as it had appeared when I started 5 weeks earlier, cluttered with debris, furniture scattered across floors, paperwork piled in corners where water damage had created ideal conditions for institutional decay. According to her documentation, I'd maintained the East Wing in perfect condition for weeks, ensuring that the building remained properly abandoned and ready for eventual demolition when the city's redevelopment timeline reached the appropriate phase. My volunteer hours were complete, she informed me, but the project could benefit from ongoing maintenance if I wanted to continue working. Some buildings, especially institutional facilities with complex histories, required regular attention to preserve their architectural integrity during the abandonment process. The work was important, she explained. Without proper maintenance, abandoned buildings could deteriorate too quickly, losing the particular character that made them suitable for urban renewal projects. Some cleanup work, I've learned, is designed to maintain rather than remove. The buildings we're preparing for demolition need proper care to preserve their state of abandonment until the time comes for their transition to new purpose. The East Wing is in excellent condition now. Clean enough to be properly demolished, abandoned enough to justify demolition, maintained at the perfect balance between decay and structural integrity. I continue the volunteer work on weekends. The rooms need regular attention to preserve their readiness for the eventual demolition that will transform this space into something the community needs. The film production assistant was apologetic about the unusual schedule. "We know it's inconvenient, working nights in an abandoned hospital," she said, reviewing my contract details. "But the director wants authentic atmosphere for the medical scenes, and your ICU experience is exactly what we need." The money was excellent. 3 nights of consultation work that would pay more than a month of regular nursing shifts. My job was simple: ensure medical accuracy in the film's hospital scenes, help actors understand proper patient care procedures, and verify that the props and set design looked authentic to healthcare professionals. Mercy General Hospital had been closed since 2018. But the production company had rented the facility for a medical thriller that required realistic hospital settings. The abandoned building provided genuine institutional atmosphere that couldn't be replicated on a studio soundstage. My first night was scheduled for Tuesday, 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., standard night shift hours that matched my regular work schedule at City Medical Center. The film crew would be shooting overnight scenes in the ICU and cardiac units, using my expertise to ensure clinical accuracy in their portrayal of critical care medicine. The building felt familiar despite its abandonment. Hospital architecture follows predictable patterns, and Mercy General's layout matched the institutional design I'd worked in for 8 years. Long corridors, nurses' stations positioned for optimal visibility, Patient rooms arranged for efficient staff access. The production team had done remarkable work preparing the medical sets. Patient rooms were equipped with authentic-looking monitors, IV pumps, and life support equipment. The props were convincing replicas of actual medical devices, accurate enough to fool healthcare professionals. But when the director called action at midnight, the equipment started functioning, not just blinking lights and beeping sounds, actual medical monitoring. The cardiac monitors displayed real EKG rhythms, blood pressure readings fluctuated within normal parameters, and oxygen saturation levels updated continuously as if connected to actual patients. Impressive effects work, I told the prop master. The vital signs look completely authentic. He looked confused. We're not running the monitors tonight. Those are just props for background shots. But the equipment was clearly operational. I watched EKG patterns that matched textbook examples of stable cardiac rhythm, monitored blood pressure readings that indicated patients in good physiological condition. The medical devices were providing genuine clinical data with the precision I expected from actual hospital equipment. The director was pleased with the authentic atmosphere, but asked me to help with patient interactions that weren't in the original script. Actors dressed as patients needed assistance with their performances, coaching on how to respond to medical procedures with realistic accuracy. The first patient was an elderly man in room 247, connected to cardiac monitoring equipment that showed stable vital signs. He was conscious and alert, responding to questions with the cooperation typical of patients who understand their medical situation. "I've been waiting for my medication," he said when I approached his bedside. "The night nurse usually comes by at 12:30. I explained that this was a film production, not an actual hospital, but he seemed confused by my response. According to his understanding, he was a cardiac patient under observation following a minor procedure, and I was the night nurse responsible for his care. The medication administration record at his bedside was filled out in handwriting I recognized as my own, documenting medication schedules and nursing assessments I had no memory of providing. The patient's chart contained detailed notes about his condition, treatment progress, and care plan, all signed with my name and nursing license number. Room after room contained similar patients, all requiring standard nursing care procedures. Medication administration, vital sign monitoring, patient education about their conditions. Each patient chart was documented with my professional assessments, my clinical observations, my nursing interventions. I was apparently managing a full patient census during what I thought was a film consultation assignment. The patients weren't actors. They were actual hospital patients, aware of their medical conditions, familiar with their treatment protocols, expecting competent nursing care from qualified medical professionals. Their vital signs were stable, their conditions were manageable, and their care plans reflected standard medical practice. But according to their admission dates, they had been patients at Mercy General for decades. Some had been receiving continuous care since the 1980s, maintaining stable conditions under nursing supervision that had apparently included me without my conscious awareness. Patient charts documented my nursing assessments dating back years, chronicling my professional observations of their medical progress, my medication administration records, my patient education documentation. I had been their primary nurse for extended periods, providing the kind of continuity care that produces excellent patient outcomes. At 3:12 a.m., the intercom system activated with a familiar announcement. Medication rounds, Nurse Patterson. Patient care assignments ready for review. My nursing supervisor's voice, providing the standard night shift coordination I remembered from years of hospital work. But when I responded through the intercom system, asking for clarification about my patient assignments, my own voice answered back with detailed information about medication schedules and care priorities. I was both the nurse receiving assignments and the supervisor providing them, coordinating patient care through internal communication systems that shouldn't have existed in an abandoned hospital. The medication cart in the supply room was stocked with current pharmaceuticals, properly labeled and stored according to hospital protocols. My nursing keys provided access to controlled substances, and the medication orders matched the prescriptions documented in patient charts. Everything I needed to provide professional nursing care was available and properly organized. as if the hospital had never stopped operating, and I had never stopped working night shifts in this facility. By 4 a.m. I had completed medication rounds for 37 patients, documented vital signs and nursing assessments, responded to call lights, and provided the kind of comprehensive care that characterizes competent night shift nursing. The patients were stable, their conditions were well managed, and their care plans reflected the therapeutic progress possible when chronic medical conditions receive consistent, professional nursing attention over extended periods. When the morning shift arrived at 7 a.m., they thanked me for maintaining excellent patient care standards during another quiet night. The charge nurse reviewed my documentation and commended my thorough nursing assessments, my attention to medication timing, and my professional response to patient needs. According to the shift report I apparently provided, all patients had remained stable throughout the night, no emergencies had required physician notification, and the quality of care met the high standards expected in a professional medical facility. The film production assistant paid me for 3 nights of consultation work, but the timesheet showed I'd been working night shifts at Mercy General for months. My nursing license was on file with the hospital's Human Resources Department. My professional references had been verified, and my employee ID badge provided access to all areas of the medical facility. The patient census had grown since my previous shift. New admissions required nursing assessments, medication reconciliation, and care plan development. The medical complexity was increasing, but the staffing remained adequate to provide quality patient care. Some nursing assignments, I've learned, extend beyond conventional employment arrangements. The patients need continuous care, the medical conditions require professional management, and night shift staffing must maintain therapeutic standards, regardless of the hospital's official operational status. The work is rewarding. Patient outcomes are excellent, medication management is precise, and the therapeutic relationships developed over extended care periods produce the kind of nursing satisfaction that originally drew me to healthcare. The call lights are glowing for the next shift. Patient care never stops, even in hospitals that officially closed years ago, but continue operating to serve the medical needs of patients who require ongoing professional nursing attention. The dispatch came through at 2:17 a.m., same as always. Engine 7, structure fire reported at Riverside State Hospital Complex. Caller reports smoke visible from Ward C. I knew the location too well. Riverside had been demolished in 1991, but emergency calls kept routing to the original address. Probably kids accessing the old foundation. Maybe transients using the former basement areas for shelter. We'd responded to the same coordinates 4 times in the past 2 months. Standard protocol for abandoned structure fires. Respond with full equipment. Assess for actual emergency. Clear any unauthorized personnel. Document false alarm if applicable. The building didn't exist anymore, but the emergency services couldn't simply ignore calls reporting active fires at known addresses. My partner Jake was driving when we turned onto Riverside Avenue. There, he said, pointing through his windshield. The hospital stood exactly where it should be, 3 stories of brick and institutional windows, with visible smoke drifting from the east wing. Not the empty lot with scattered concrete that we'd found during previous calls. A fully intact hospital complex showing clear signs of active fire. Wasn't this demolished? Jake asked, pulling up to the main entrance. I was asking myself the same question, but protocol was protocol. Structure fire, possible occupancy, full response regardless of questions about the building's existence. We deployed equipment and approached the main entrance to assess interior conditions. The lobby was filled with smoke, but not the dense, acrid smoke of structural fires. This was lighter, more like steam than combustion byproducts. The building's fire alarm system was active, cycling through evacuation signals with mechanical precision. I activated my thermal imaging camera to locate heat sources and identify safe entry routes. The camera showed heat signatures throughout the building, not the concentrated hotspots typical of fire, but distributed warmth consistent with human occupancy. Dozens of people moving through corridors, gathering in common areas, following evacuation procedures with organized efficiency. The thermal signatures showed adult-sized heat patterns, walking normally, responding to the fire alarm system like occupants familiar with emergency protocols. Jake, Thermal shows heavy occupancy. We need backup for evacuation coordination. I radioed for additional units while tracking the heat signatures through the building. The occupants were following proper evacuation routes, moving toward marked exits with the discipline of people who had practiced emergency procedures. But when we reached the areas where thermal imaging showed the highest concentration of people, we found empty corridors. No voices, no footsteps, no evidence of recent human presence. Just the persistent warmth that registered on our equipment as body heat from occupants who weren't visible to direct observation. The thermal camera continued tracking movement throughout the building. Heat signatures climbed stairwells, passed through fire doors, congregated in safe areas designated for evacuation assembly. The camera showed a complete emergency evacuation in progress, managed with professional efficiency by occupants, who appeared only as thermal shadows. We followed evacuation routes to the main assembly, area where thermal imaging showed approximately 60 people gathered in organized groups. The camera displayed heat patterns consistent with families staying together, medical staff maintaining accountability for patients, administrative personnel coordinating emergency response. The assembly area was empty except for the steady warmth that our equipment interpreted as human bodies, maintaining normal physiological temperature, control. Engine 7. We have thermal readings showing full building evacuation in progress, but no visual confirmation of occupants. Request instruction for phantom emergency response. Dispatch responded with coordination protocols for multi-casualty incidents. Engine 7 backup units en route. Establish command post for evacuation management. Report occupancy count when available. According to our thermal imaging, we were managing the evacuation of a fully occupied hospital during an active fire emergency. The heat signatures showed medical staff wheeling patients on gurneys, security guards checking rooms for stragglers, administrators coordinating with emergency responders. But we were the only people visible at the scene. The backup units arrived with sirens and emergency lighting, responding to our reports of heavy occupancy requiring evacuation assistance. Engine 12, Ladder 3, and the Incident Command Vehicle, deployed with full personnel for a major structural fire with civilian involvement. Chief Morrison established the command post exactly where thermal imaging showed the greatest concentration of evacuated occupants. What's the occupancy count? He asked, reviewing deployment plans for a multi-story hospital fire. Thermal shows approximately 80 people evacuated successfully, I reported. No visual confirmation, but heat signatures indicate all occupants have reached safe assembly areas. The thermal imaging was consistent across all equipment. Multiple cameras from different units showed identical heat signature patterns, confirming that our readings weren't equipment malfunction. The building was occupied by people who generated body heat but weren't visible to normal observation. Chief Morrison coordinated interior attack teams to locate and suppress the fire source. The thermal cameras guided crews through corridors where heat signatures indicated safe passage routes, avoiding areas where thermal patterns suggested structural hazards. But the interior teams found no active fire. No heat sources except the distributed warmth of human occupancy. No smoke except the light haze that seemed to originate from the building's normal operations rather than combustion. The fire alarm system continued cycling through emergency signals, but the building showed no evidence of actual fire damage. Electrical systems were active, lighting was functional, and the facility appeared to be operating normally despite decades of abandonment. Emergency response continued for 3 hours, following protocols for hospital evacuation with full documentation of occupancy status, evacuation procedures, and fire suppression activities. The thermal imaging showed occupants returning to the building once the all-clear was given, resuming normal activities with the cooperation typical of well-trained institutional staff. Our incident report documented successful evacuation of approximately 80 hospital occupants during a reported structure fire, with no casualties and minimal property damage. The thermal evidence supported a major emergency response that had been managed with professional efficiency by on-scene personnel. But the report also noted that no occupants were visually confirmed during the entire emergency response. The evacuation was documented entirely through thermal imaging equipment that showed heat signatures consistent with human presence, but no people who could be directly observed. When we returned to the station, Chief Morrison reviewed the thermal imaging footage with technical support staff. The heat signatures were clear and consistent, showing organized human activity throughout the emergency response. The camera data supported our reports of heavy occupancy, requiring full emergency protocols, but satellite imagery from the same time period showed Engine 7 responding to an empty lot. No building, no smoke, no evidence of the hospital complex where we'd conducted a major evacuation operation. Some emergency calls, I've learned, require response to situations that exist in thermal imaging but not in visible reality. The people we evacuate aren't always people we can see directly, but they're real enough to generate body heat that our equipment detects and our protocols require us to protect. The building continues operating normally between emergency calls. Thermal imaging shows regular occupancy patterns, normal daily activities, the kind of institutional routine that characterizes hospitals where professional staff provide continuous care for patients who need ongoing medical attention. We'll respond again when the next smoke call comes in. Emergency services are available 24 hours a day, even for occupants who can only be seen through thermal imaging cameras. The City Council's request was straightforward. Prepare a comprehensive redevelopment proposal for the former Oakwood State Hospital site. 23 acres of prime residential land, existing infrastructure, and buildings that could potentially be renovated rather than demolished. Standard urban planning work that I'd performed for similar institutional sites throughout the county. My assignment was to evaluate the property's potential for mixed-income housing development, assess renovation versus demolition costs, and create preliminary designs that would demonstrate the site's value for community housing needs. Professional planning work that would help the city make informed decisions about property development. Oakwood had operated as a state psychiatric facility from 1948 to 1989, leaving behind a complex of brick buildings arranged around landscaped courtyards. The architecture was solid mid-century institutional design, good bones that could potentially be converted to residential use with appropriate renovation investment. I began with site surveying, documenting existing structures and infrastructure conditions. The main building was 4 stories with good structural integrity, suitable for conversion to apartment units. The smaller buildings could become townhouses or community facilities. The grounds offered adequate parking and green space for family residential development. My preliminary sketches focused on maintaining the site's architectural character while adapting spaces for contemporary housing needs. Patient rooms could become bedrooms, common areas could be converted to family living spaces, and the institutional kitchens could serve community dining facilities. The work was engaging, transforming spaces originally designed for institutional care into environments where families could build homes and communities. Urban planning at its best, converting abandoned facilities into resources that addressed current housing needs. But when I returned to my office the next morning, my preliminary sketches had been completed by someone else. Not just filled in or corrected, professionally finished with architectural detail that would normally require weeks of technical drafting. My rough layout concepts had been developed into comprehensive floor plans, complete with precise measurements, building code compliance notations, and engineering specifications. The completed plans were clearly based on my initial concepts, but showed a level of technical expertise and site-specific knowledge that exceeded my preliminary work. Someone with advanced architectural training had taken my basic sketches and developed them into construction-ready documents. I assumed collaboration from the city's planning department and contacted my supervisor about the unauthorized assistance. She confirmed that no other planners had been assigned to the Oakwood project, and the drawings showed no evidence of our standard collaboration protocols. The architectural modifications weren't just random improvements. They demonstrated intimate knowledge of the existing buildings, structural details that weren't visible during my site survey, utility systems that hadn't been documented in historical records, room layouts that suggested familiarity with how the spaces had actually functioned during the hospital's operational years. Someone who had worked in the building was continuing my planning work with institutional memory that informed better design decisions. Over the following weeks, the pattern continued. Each night, my preliminary work would be developed into increasingly sophisticated architectural proposals. My rough housing concepts became detailed renovation plans. My basic infrastructure assessments became comprehensive engineering reports. The documents were professionally prepared, meeting city planning standards and building code requirements with technical accuracy that matched work from experienced architectural firms. But they were produced overnight, without my participation, by expertise I hadn't contracted. The renovation proposals were remarkably sensitive to the site's institutional history. Instead of generic housing conversion, the plans preserved elements that honored the building's original purpose while creating residential spaces that would serve contemporary family needs patient. Rooms were converted to bedrooms with careful attention to natural light and privacy. Common areas became community spaces that maintained the social interaction patterns that had made institutional life tolerable. The dining facilities were designed for community, meals that would preserve the supportive relationships that characterized successful institutional care. The anonymous architect seemed to understand how people had actually lived in these buildings, what aspects of institutional design had been therapeutic, and how residential conversion could preserve beneficial community structures while eliminating the restrictive elements of psychiatric hospitalization. But the most significant modifications appeared in areas I hadn't surveyed. The completed plans showed extensive underground facilities, residential units, community services, infrastructure systems that extended the development far beyond the visible hospital complex. Basement levels that I'd never documented, sub-basements that weren't indicated in historical blueprints, underground parking and utilities that would support a much larger residential population. When I returned to Oakwood with ground-penetrating radar to verify the underground additions, the equipment confirmed structural elements exactly where the plans indicated they existed. Foundation walls, floor systems, utility conduits, all matching the architectural drawings I'd never created. The hospital complex was significantly larger than I'd realized during my initial survey. But when I attempted to access the underground levels through entrances shown in the plans, I found only sealed doors and filled stairwells. The architectural drawings showed spaces that existed structurally, but weren't accessible through normal building entrances. That changed during my final site visit. Arrived to find construction crews throughout the complex, following renovation plans that matched the documents appearing in my office. Workers were exposing the underground levels I'd discovered in the drawings, creating access routes that connected existing buildings to residential facilities I'd never seen. Morning. Ms. Richardson called a project foreman I'd never met. The residential units are coming along nicely. Should have Phase 1 ready for occupancy next month, according to the construction schedule posted at the job site. I'd been managing the Oakwood renovation project for over a year, overseeing conversion work that would create 200 units of mixed-income housing with community facilities designed to serve both new residents and former patients who had remained connected to the site. The residential units were being prepared for families who needed the kind of supportive community environment that successful institutional design had provided. Housing for people who required more social connection than conventional residential development typically offered. Current residents were moving into completed units as construction progressed. Individuals and families who appreciated community living, shared resources, and the supportive relationships that had made institutional life therapeutic rather than restrictive. When I asked the foreman about the project timeline, he showed me planning documents in my handwriting that detailed community development extending through the next decade. My signature appeared on municipal approvals, construction contracts, and community service agreements for residential development I'd never consciously designed. The final architectural drawings showed the completed community, Oakwood residential development, a mixed-income housing complex that preserved the therapeutic elements of institutional design while providing family housing that addressed contemporary community needs. My name appeared as the project planner, credited with designing residential solutions that honored the site's institutional history while creating living environments that supported both individual, families, and community wellness. The residential complex was operating successfully, with waiting lists for units that offered the kind of supportive community living that had made institutional life beneficial for residents who thrived in collaborative social environments. Some urban planning, I've learned, involves collaboration with the institutional memory embedded in buildings that understand how people can live together successfully. The architectural proposals reflect not just professional planning expertise, but the accumulated wisdom of spaces that have housed communities for decades. The development is proceeding excellently. The residential units are well designed. The community facilities serve both practical and social needs, and the renovation has preserved the architectural elements that made institutional living therapeutically successful for residents who needed supportive community environments. I should be proud of the planning solutions we've developed together. The families are settling in well, and the community is developing the kind of mutual support that successful institutional design had always been intended to foster. The Historical Preservation Grant was specific about its requirements. Locate and digitize any remaining patient records from Millbrook State Hospital to complete the state's institutional history database. Standard archival work that I'd performed at dozens of defunct mental health facilities across 3 states. Most abandoned hospitals had been efficiently stripped of documentation during their closure processes. Patient files transferred to successor institutions, administrative records shipped to state archives, only scattered paperwork remaining in buildings that had been properly decommissioned. But Millbrook's closure had been abrupt. Budget cuts that forced immediate facility shutdown without adequate time for proper documentation transfer. The Historical Society hoped that patient records might remain in the building, forgotten in storage areas that hadn't been thoroughly cleared. My job was to conduct a comprehensive search of the complex, locate any surviving documentation, and preserve materials that would contribute to historical understanding of institutional mental health care during the mid-20th century. The building had been secured since closure, with structural integrity maintained for potential historical preservation. The interior remained largely intact, patient rooms, administrative offices, and service areas preserved in the condition they'd held when the hospital stopped operations. I began with obvious locations: medical records departments, administrative filing areas, patient information centers. Most had been thoroughly cleared, leaving only empty filing cabinets and scattered forms too damaged to be historically significant. But in the basement of Ward C, I discovered a records room that had been overlooked during the facility's closure. The room contained floor-to-ceiling filing cabinets, meticulously organized and labeled with patient identification systems that matched historical hospital protocols. Thousands of patient files, treatment documentation, admission records, and discharge summaries spanning nearly 40 years of institutional operations. The documentation was in remarkable condition, preserved by the basement's stable temperature and humidity conditions. Patient files contained detailed treatment histories, psychiatric evaluations, medication records, and progress notes that would provide invaluable insight into mid-century mental health care practices. This was exactly the kind of historical treasure that preservation grants were designed to locate and protect. I established a workstation in the records room and began the systematic documentation process required for archival digitization. Each file required individual assessment, condition evaluation, and priority classification before scanning could begin. The patient ledgers were particularly valuable, comprehensive registers that tracked admissions, treatments, and outcomes for every individual who had received care at Millbrook. The ledgers provided statistical data about institutional operations while preserving individual patient narratives that illustrated broader patterns of psychiatric treatment. But as I worked through the chronological series of patient ledgers, I found volumes that shouldn't have existed. The final ledger in the series was dated 1987-2024, spanning from the hospital's closure through the present year. The volume contained detailed patient entries documenting admissions, treatments, and ongoing care for individuals who had apparently been receiving services at Millbrook long after the facility's official closure. According to this ledger, the hospital had never stopped operating. Patient admissions continued regularly, new treatment programs had been implemented, and medical staff provided continuous psychiatric care for a population of residents who had remained at the facility despite its official decommissioning. The entries were written in multiple hands, representing different medical professionals who had apparently maintained clinical operations at Millbrook for nearly 4 decades after state funding ended. Treatment notes reflected contemporary psychiatric practices, medication protocols that hadn't existed during the hospital's original operational period, and therapeutic interventions that represented current best practices in mental health care. The most recent entries were dated this week. Patient number 88847. Treatment response continues positive. Integration with archival research project providing therapeutic benefit through meaningful work assignment. Recommend continuation of documentation therapy protocol. Patient R9102. Adjustment to residential community proceeding well. Demonstrates excellent organizational skills through historical preservation work. Consider permanent assignment to records management responsibilities. Patient number 9248. Shows exceptional dedication to institutional history project. Archival expertise valuable for ongoing documentation needs. Treatment plan should incorporate long-term research collaboration. The patient numbers corresponded to a coding system I didn't recognize, but the treatment descriptions were clearly referring to recent activities. Someone was documenting the therapeutic progress of patients who were participating in historical research, archival documentation, and institutional preservation work. I checked the identification key for the patient numbers and found my own name listed under number 9248. According to the patient ledger, I had been admitted to Millbrook 3 days earlier for research-focused therapy involving intensive archival, immersion designed to address professional isolation and historical disconnection disorders. My treatment plan included detailed documentation of my background, my qualifications for archival work, and my therapeutic needs as assessed by staff psychiatrists who had apparently been monitoring my work in the records room. Patient demonstrates exceptional aptitude for historical research and shows significant improvement when engaged in meaningful documentation work. Recommend extended treatment involving comprehensive patient record digitization project. Long-term residential assignment appropriate for continued therapeutic progress. The notes were signed by Dr. Margaret Hendricks, Chief of Psychiatric Services, with current contact information and medical license, numbers that I verified through online databases. Dr. Hendricks was a practicing psychiatrist affiliated with several contemporary mental health facilities, but, according to Millbrook's historical records, Dr. Hendricks had never been employed at the hospital during its operational years. I attempted to contact Dr. Hendricks to clarify the patient ledger entries, but reached an answering service that took messages for Millbrook State Hospital Psychiatric Services. The receptionist confirmed my appointment for treatment, plan review, and reminded me about medication, compliance requirements that I didn't remember receiving. When I checked my personal identification, I found a Millbrook patient ID card in my wallet alongside my driver's license and Historical Society credentials. The card was professionally produced, with my photograph and a patient number that matched the ledger entries documenting my therapeutic progress. My admission paperwork was filed in the same cabinet system I'd been digitizing, inserted in chronological order between historical patient files I'd been reviewing all week. The intake assessment described my professional background, my qualifications for archival work, and my psychological evaluation indicating that intensive document research would provide optimal therapeutic benefit. The assessment was signed by myself, apparently in my capacity as both patient and consulting archivist, with notation that dual roles would enhance treatment effectiveness through professional engagement in meaningful work activities. My treatment team included other archival researchers, historical preservation specialists, and documentation experts who were apparently receiving similar therapy through collaborative institutional history projects. We were all patients at Millbrook, all engaged in preserving the hospital's historical records as part of our psychiatric treatment. The digital scanning equipment I'd been using was located in the former patient activity room, where therapeutic work assignments had always been an integral part of treatment programming. My archival documentation work was continuation of occupational therapy protocols that had been successfully used at Millbrook for decades. The historical preservation grant funding my work had been approved by the same state agency that had originally funded Millbrook's psychiatric services. The grants were designed to maintain institutional operations through research projects that served both historical preservation and patient care objectives. My professional credentials were valid. My archival expertise was genuine, and my documentation work was contributing to valuable historical preservation. But the work was also part of my psychiatric treatment, administered by medical staff who understood that meaningful professional engagement enhanced therapeutic outcomes for patients with my specific diagnostic profile. The final entry in the current patient ledger was written in my handwriting, documenting my treatment progress from my own clinical perspective. Patient number 9248 demonstrates excellent integration with archival research assignment. Professional expertise in historical documentation providing significant therapeutic benefit. Patient shows insight into collaborative treatment model and expresses satisfaction with residential placement at Millbrook. Recommend continuation of current treatment plan with expanded research responsibilities. Patient ready for permanent assignment to institutional preservation program. Some historical research I've learned involves becoming part of the history you're documenting. The patient records I'm preserving include my own treatment documentation, and the institutional history I'm writing includes my ongoing therapeutic progress. The work is meaningful, the treatment is effective, and the collaborative model allows patients with professional expertise to contribute their skills while receiving the psychiatric care that enables optimal functioning. The records preservation project will continue indefinitely. There are decades of patient files requiring documentation, and the institutional history of Millbrook includes ongoing treatment services that need proper archival maintenance. My flashlight is dimming as I complete the final entries, but the work continues in darkness that feels comfortable and familiar. The sound of a pen scratching in the dark is therapeutic, productive, and part of a treatment program that has been remarkably successful for patients who thrive in collaborative research environments. Status: observing, documenting, admitted permanently to the institutional history that will preserve these records for future researchers who may discover they were always part of the story they came to study.